You checking in with Mike Williams from the LA Chargers, and you're tuning into Chargers Unleashed.
Welcome to another edition of Chargers Unleashed. Jake Hefner and Wolkenstein here with you from the LAFB Network. Today's show, of course, is being brought to you by BetOnline, Aura, AG1, Mint Mobile, and Rock Solid Sports Memorabilia. If this is your first time tuning into the show, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Dan Wolkenstein. Cut down day is here.
We made
Chargers
it.
53-man roster is finalized. Some surprises. Based off of our show yesterday, things we definitely were not expecting to take place. So we'll obviously get into that as the show rolls on. But to help us break down everything as it currently stands right now with the 53-man roster, with training camp standouts, and as we get closer to week 1 of the NFL regular season, as I always like to say, Dan Wolkenstein working the phones once again. Special guest on the show for Chargers Unleashed today, Dan Wolkenstein, if you would.
Yes, Chargers team reporter, Super Bowl host, by the way. She's glowing up before our eyes, which is incredible to see. Friend of the show, Hayley Elwood, joins Chargers Unleashed to talk about all things 53-man roster, some surprises, like you mentioned, Jake, as well as we'll talk about Miami, what to expect from this defensive identity, Justin Herbert and the receivers, all of that and more. Exciting times, Chargers fans, we made it. We finally got to the 53-man roster. Again, the initial 53-man roster. Things could very well change. But we saw some interesting news, Jake. Elijah Dotson, week 1 preseason darling, makes the team. AJ Finley comes out of nowhere to make the team. Stone Smartt, they go with 4 tight ends. Stone Smartt makes the team. Some guys obviously did not make the team. Notable names that did not make it, Jake. Tywan Mullen, Jerron Clark, Max Duggan, among the names.
Zach Bailey.
Zach Bailey, which a lot of people have questions about. Makes you wonder about the offensive line depth. Both John Hightower and Keelan Doss did not make the initial 53-man roster. Again, this is early. We'll see how things go when the 1,500 other players are announced officially. But lots of things to dissect, but excited to talk about who did make the team with Hayley Elwood. Coming up next on Chargers Unleashed. But before we get to that, Jake, let's talk about our friends over at Aura. Identity theft prevention is real. Jake, how many times have you and I gotten those spam calls from robocallers or people asking us for random information that we got to sell all of our stuff and they try to get all of our money and everything and identity, and it's a pain in the butt. Our friends over at Aura are helping with all of that. 2 weeks free trial. Check it out with our friends over at Aura. We'll be back in 45 seconds to talk with special guest Hayley Elwood on Chargers Unleashed.
Have you ever Googled yourself and were shocked to see your personal information exposed on one of those public listing sites? Data brokers are making a fortune selling your information to robocallers, spammers, and others who want to learn more about you, like where you live.
We've been trying to reach you concerning your car's extended warranty.
That's why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, Aura. Aura can identify data brokers exposing your info and submit opt-out requests on your behalf, and brokers everywhere are legally required to remove your info if you ask them to, but they make it super hard to do. So let Aura handle that for you. You could try Aura for up to 2 weeks using this link that we're going to put up here on the screen. Aura also does so much more to protect you and your family from online threats that you cannot see. So make sure to check out aura.com/Chargers Unleashed to get a 14-day free trial and see if your personal information has been leaked online.
Well, we are very excited, very fortunate to have friend of the show and special guest, Chargers team reporter and Super Bowl host, by the way, Hayley Elwood joins us on Chargers Unleashed, I believe, for the 3rd year. This is becoming an inaugural thing. Hayley, welcome to Chargers Unleashed again. How are you?
Thanks, guys. I'm great. I know we were just kind of talking off camera. I said this is like a tradition unlike any other. We are about to kick off the season, and I join you, and here we are, back at it, another year. The off season's just crazy, right? It just flies by like nobody's business. And then here we are in it's September at the end of this week, right? That's nuts.
Yeah, Jake, it's only September. It's like just a couple days away.
See, to the people who experience the offseason the way I do, it's like the hours go by and they feel like years. So just to get to this point in general feels like it's been a trek since January. So happy we're finally here. Happy for the start of the season.
Yeah. So we have a very fun show today, and very timely as we just got word of the 53-man roster being finalized. Some surprise keeps and releases, which we'll kind of get into a little bit here. Obviously, you got to talk about kind of preseason storylines and training camp kind of aftermath, if you will. We'll talk about some of the expectations of this team, and then finally get into week 1 preview, which we actually get to talk about real football here in just less than 10 days. But Hayley, starting off, 53-man roster, some surprise keeps on the team. I think the one that is most surprising, at least to folks outside, AJ Finley, the safety. Elijah Dotson, week 1 darling, was kept as well. Some cuts, but what are your thoughts on the overall 53 that remain on the roster? I know it's initial, but what are your thoughts on the team so far?
That's the key word, right? The initial 53 is, I forget when you guys put this out, but if it's tomorrow, which would be Wednesday, who knows how many more changes might happen until then. But look, I do want to talk about AJ Finley for a second, because one of the best parts of my job in training camp is to be on our preseason broadcast. And that means getting to talk with the Chargers players and coaches, in production meetings. We get to kind of, tap their brain and get a look into some of these guys who are maybe on the back end of the roster, who obviously otherwise wouldn't get talked about. And AJ Finley came up numerous times, and Brandon Staley specifically mentioned how good of a makeup he has, and he really thought he had a chance to make it. And Derek Ansley sort of echoed those comments as well, that he really stands out. And I think when you look at him and when you look at Dotson, it's really what you do in games, right? Like, that's the biggest part of the offseason of training camp and the preseason. Is training camp's great and guys are out there and you can make plays, but you're going up against your own team. Some days you're not tackling to the ground. That's the one thing we heard this entire preseason and camp was this coaching staff really wanted to emphasize tackling and really wanted to emphasize physicality. You get that opportunity in games. And I think with those two players, as of now, to make that initial 53, they clearly showed something. And I think the other thing too is we don't see it all. We're not in the meeting rooms. And so to hear kind of Staley and DA talk about Finley in that way, it's what they obviously saw on the field, but maybe some of what they saw on the back end too, that really impressed him. And so he was just one of those guys, we never got to talk really about him on the broadcast, but they were literally, I have my giant packet of notes from preseason, and he had little bullet points underneath just from some of the meetings that we had.
The wide receiver surprises, both Keelan Doss and John Hightower were released. We'll see what happens with them being brought back on the practice squad. Who knows? But wide receiver, currently there are 5. What do you make of the decision to go 5 wide receivers, 4 tight ends with Stone Smartt? Do you think that stays? What's your kind of makeup or thoughts on just 5 receivers on the team right now?
I think it's one of those things. We'll kind of see how it plays out. Obviously, Darius Davis being one of those guys, and we know where he'll be utilized probably more primarily than in the receiving game, and that would be on special teams. But I don't know. I think these rosters are so interesting off the bat because everyone has questions and everyone kind of parses through. But again, there's going to be so much movement that happens. And I think when you look at maybe if you want to call it the core 4 that the Chargers have, and Mike and Keenan and Quentin and Joshua Palmer, that's a good group right there. Building that depth behind it is going to be key. And I know we'll kind of talk about this in a little bit, but depth was one of the things that got the Chargers to the playoffs last year, having depth and having some of those, back end of some position groups sort of really rounded out. And so look, right now they're might be satisfied with what's there and currently how it stands, but you never know who else is going to get released from other teams. And you might not know, hey, if some guy goes hurt, you add guys to the practice squad and that'll obviously get filled out tomorrow. And there might be an opportunity that some of those guys come back and who knows, may make the active roster later this year.
Now, Hayley, in terms of just obviously you were out there on the sidelines throughout all of OTAs, training camp, throughout the preseason on the sidelines. And just in terms of lasting takeaways that you took from training camp and preseason overall, whether we're talking about Brandon Staley in his 3rd year, the arrival of Kellen Moore, Derek Ansley now in charge of the defense and the new players, what are some of your lasting takeaways from the last several weeks?
So it's a twofold kind of 2-pronged situation. One is that depth that I just kind of mentioned, and that's the fact that Brandon Staley said it best. This team would not have made the playoffs last year if it wasn't for the depth. Think about some of the receiving core in a few of those games and how much some of those back-ended players had to do to make up for the loss of Keenan and Mike sometimes at the same time. Yeah. So when you bring in maybe even a couple of the younger players, like the top 3 draft picks that this team had this season, those guys aren't necessarily tasked with making an impact right away, but they're getting to learn from awesome veterans in their room and really sort of be guided along. the second prong is continuity. So there weren't a whole lot of changes with this Chargers team from last year to this year. And that was something that Brandon Staley has talked about. It's something Tom Telesco has talked about. If you want to use the phrase run it back, they're running it back essentially with a couple tweaks here and there, one of them being Eric Kendricks. But because of that, Staley had said this team was really wired to respond. He had told me, and I did a report on this in the first preseason game, that they got in the room for training camp, and what did they talk about? They talked about the Jacksonville game, and they really had to confront it. But look, the large amount of the team that played in that game is back this year. So you could confront it. You could have honest conversations about it. And he said we needed to do it. And we were able to move on. But because so much of this group is still kept together, he said they're tight, they're wired to respond, and that continuity really brings confidence. The offense is new, yes, and they're kind of learning things together. The defense is back and gelling together now for a third year under Brandon Staley. But truthfully, those kind of two-pronged things, I think, is what really stood out to me and what will, hopefully bode well for this team in 2023.
You mentioned the depth. Justin Herbert was paid quite a lot of money. And what that means is the Chargers are going to have to hit on their draft picks more often than not, especially now with the new contract. And I think I want to talk about the second-year players and the rookies who, although they don't have to be making like huge roles, what you're seeing is some of these younger guys really excelling and taking a step forward. I'm talking second-year players like JT Woods. Mm-hmm. You talk about rookies like Thule, Quentin Johnson, Darius Davis, Scott Matlock. There's a whole bunch of second-year. Isaiah Spiller now looks like he's a very different player. A whole bunch of guys seem to be developing quite nicely on that younger end. Talk to us about just that younger group, what you've seen from them so far, and how maybe that's different than what we've seen years past, because you've covered the team for a bit.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think with someone like JT Woods, he was a guy who this preseason, we knew we weren't going to see Derwin out there and we weren't going to see Alohi Gilman out there. And so the way that Brandon Staley described JT Woods to the rest of us was, we want to see him run the show at safety. And we want to see him do these things. And I think he had led the team in tackles in that 49ers final preseason game. He's playing with more confidence this year. And I think you can kind of see that permeate throughout some of those other roles. Dean Leonard, Isaiah Spiller, you mentioned. And then when you get to the rookies, I'll kind of touch on what I briefly mentioned earlier, is the fact that these guys, and Brandon Staley had said this, are all, at least let's talk about Quentin, let's talk about Thule, and talk about Dayon. They are put into groups where they have these vested veterans, immediate mentorship, just right there accessible to them. So with Quentin, you have Keenan and Mike. With Thule, you have obviously Bosa and Mac. And then with Dayon, you have Kendricks and Kenneth Murray to a point. And so you get these guys in these pods with these veterans where they're able to ask them questions. I know we've talked, I'm sure you guys have, about the Thule Sir Bosa discourse that we heard throughout the preseason, but it's just a really, really awesome thing. And I'm not saying no other team has it, and I'm not saying these Chargers teams haven't had it before, but you're really walking into a situation as some of these younger guys where you're really blessed with just older players that you can look up to, who you can learn a lot from. And I think the best thing too, like I said, is the fact that those three rookies don't really have to come in, God forbid an injury happens, but they can kind of just learn the ropes and learn their role and get in when they need to get in. But it's not like you're being tasked right away with, coming off the edge and getting to the quarterback in week one, or like snap one of week one. So sure. I just think in all of those, when you kind of look at it that way, it's just really, really good and really beneficial. And you're sort of seeing, because you mentioned it, you had to pay Justin Herbert. So now you're dealing with the cap situation and all of that. And like I mentioned, though, this team was able to figure it out for 2023 and get everyone back that they wanted to get back, and bring in a guy from the outside who they really saw could add value to this team. And so financially they figured it out. But you're sort of seeing this like mentorship, younger player bond start to gel. And then it'll be interesting and just kind of fun to watch it grow throughout the season too. And again, you want everyone to stay healthy, but I think the fact that these younger guys get to learn from some of these older vets, if anything is to happen, it's a great just, learning experience that you've had right in front of you for so many weeks and months.
Now, we've obviously heard from a lot of different media pundits, the expectations for Justin Herbert this year are top-notch, sky high, and obviously with an arrival like Kellen Moore to man the offensive coordinator position, we've already kind of seen it in training camp as far as the aggressiveness, going downfield more. I wanted to get your perspective, though, as it relates to what have you seen differently from Justin Herbert this year in this particular scheme obviously with his receiving core, Keenan Allen has just had a monster preseason and training camp, but Joshua Palmer stepping up, Quentin Johnson making plays, Darius Davis being inserted into this offense. I wanted just to get your perspective on what you expect to see from Justin Herbert in this new receiving core.
So I think everyone wants to see him go downfield, right? And we've seen that a lot through camp. And we had a couple of players remind the media and whoever and said, hey, look, we still took deep shots, but, we're probably doing it a bit more now and more consistently. When Kellen Moore first came to the Chargers, I had asked him point blank, look, Justin Herbert's had a lot of change in his now going into 4 years as the quarterback of the Chargers. He's had 3 different offensive systems now. So how do you make this work? How do you figure this out? And he just said it was all about making Justin feel as comfortable as possible and making this whole thing as smooth as possible. So it came down to 3 things. It was, number one, recognizing what was good. Kellen Moore had told us in one of our meetings, he played under Joe Lombardi at one point. So he was familiar with some of the things that the Chargers had previously done. Number 2, implementing some of the things that he liked from Dallas that he thought worked really well. And then number 3, just building it together. And Justin had told us the same thing, that it feels very customizable in a sense, that they're all sort of discussing it and working through it, and that they've been able to really customize and sort of fine tune how they want to fine tune it. When it comes to the receiving core, I think you kind of saw some guys and heard some guys talk about this. Mike Williams specifically, they're moving guys around. I mean, Mike Williams had said he lined up in different spots throughout this training camp. He's working the middle of the field a little bit more. And so we've heard a lot about this like basketball team that the Chargers have at wide receiver. And I'm 5'2" and they're all just gigantic to me anyway. But when you have the height, Justin has the height. He can put the ball in places that no one else can get to. I mean, you can be the most athletically gifted defensive back on earth, but that height's there, that's an automatic disadvantage. Again, I'm 5'2". I can understand these things when I hold a microphone up. Just kidding. But I think, that's one of the things that we'll see is maybe some wide receiver movement, moving guys around. Keenan obviously is fantastic in the slot, but what else can he do now? Where else can he go? And I think you add Quentin Johnston to that mix, and you're looking obviously with Joshua Palmer too, but you're looking at a really, really good receiving core that it's kind of exciting though, because we didn't really get a look at it obviously during the preseason because none of them played. And so now really we get to see week 1, what is this all about? But the conversations that we have heard coaches have, players have, it seems to be going really well. And it really seems like there was just this intention from the start of really making sure everyone was on board, everyone was together, and they were sort of building it together from the ground. Not necessarily, I should say, from the ground up, but building it together to get it to where they want it to be and want everyone to feel most comfortable with.
One of the words other than tough and rugged, because you hear that word those 2 words like all the time, but other than those 2 words, explosiveness or explosion or any variation of that word, I think was mentioned by so many players and coaching staff on like biggest differences between this year and years prior. To you, and everyone immediately thinks explosive plays down the field. Like that's not necessarily all that it is. We talked about like the running game has improved drastically. How much more explosiveness do you think we're going to see in general than what we saw in years past? Because like last year, for example, the running game was kind of non-existent and Austin Eckler had to kind of do everything himself. And this year, you have a healthy offensive line. You have a little bit easier, simplified run scheme. Kellen Moore comes in. Isaiah Spiller takes the next step. Like, talk to us about just explosiveness in general that we can expect.
I think Joshua Kelly, too. You look at that 3rd preseason game, and he's just off and running for a 75-yard touchdown. And I talked to him after the game and made a joke, in the final preseason game in 2022, he hurdled that guy in New Orleans in the Mercedes-Benz Superdome or whatever.
Right.
And then in this game, he's just taken off and running. And Daniel Jeremiah on the broadcast was making a joke like, man, that guy Thumper isn't a good nickname anymore for him because he's just got speed running down there. And so I think that's a great point. I think with the run game specifically, you now are it's probably going to be a little more multifaceted in a sense, because you saw what Kellen Moore was able to do in Dallas with 2 very different style of running backs, but it worked really well for him and for them, I should say, also for him. But now when you have the Eckler type and maybe pair it with the Joshua Kelly, who I think we can all safely say is the solidified number 2 back at this point and really worked his tail off to get there. Deja vu again, because we had this conversation a year ago. But I think it's just fitting guys really well and almost giving guys a fresh start. And so I think you'll see those explosive plays. I think the one thing is, we heard Justin Herbert talk a lot about this and some of the other teammates as well, that there's sort of this, he had actually told us at one point, I think in a production meeting, the goal is to play fearless this year. And I didn't ask if he was a Swiftie or anything like that, but the goal is to just play fearless and not really have to worry about everything that's going on. You don't like a play, you check out of it and get out and you go on to something new. And so I think that's the maturation that you obviously want to see now with the quarterback in his 4th year, but it's the trust that's being built between the quarterback, between the coaching staff, and between the other players as well, that you're going to go out and execute this offense. And yeah, I think explosiveness is something that we'll probably see. I don't know how much, and I'm not sure everyone wants to put a label on how many deep shots they'll be taking every game, but I think the takeaway is if it's there, they'll take it. If it's there, it's there. And that'll be fun to see, because that's what we've been wanting to see, right? And Justin Herbert used that incredible arm that he has. And so if you balance that with the run game, which essentially doomed them in the Jacksonville game too. There was just a complete inability in that second half to run the ball. These are the things that made your team better, that you knew you had to work on to get better, and will bode well this coming season.
No, I will say we'll keep the Taylor Swift theme going. The team needs to shake it off. What happened in Jacksonville? We know the love story between Khalil Mack, Joey Bosa. I mean, I can go all day on this, but let's switch to the defense here for a second. Lots of changes. Eric Ansley, more vocal, etc. What are your expectations of the defense, specifically this year versus last?
So I think more physicality, and I think a lot of it is also going to come down to the addition of Eric Kendricks. I truly do think we have heard Brandon Staley talk about him a lot, that he was sort of, look, the 2023 offseason of the Chargers was vastly different than the 2022. They weren't making all the splashy things week after week, day after day. But Eric Kendricks was a huge factor to bring him on. And Staley from the get-go said, dude, this guy's an all-pro. Like, he knows how to run the show. And he said his addition has been significant. And so keeping him in the middle there, Staley had told us that the inside linebacker group is probably the most improved group he's seen on this roster so far, heading in, during this offseason, that just adding Kendricks, the growth of Kenneth Murray, adding Dayon, bringing these guys kind of together and all kind of bringing them along with Amon and Neiman, has really elevated sort of everyone to play their best football. And so when you get a veteran like Eric Kendricks in there, who is likely going to be calling plays, wearing the green dot, running the show, it's helpful. And it helps everyone else along, right? Because you don't have to worry, the back end, and Derwin's probably going to feel a lot more comfortable. And then the front end, because you got this guy who's been there before, done it before. And so I think, we also heard Joey talk a lot about wanting to get better at defending the run, which is something that this Chargers team hasn't been, I don't want to say hasn't been particularly great at, but at times it's definitely been a downfall of them. So he's done things like adjusted his weight and gotten more physical and done more things to kind of get better at that. And again, these are really only things that you can do in a game, because we haven't seen them in the preseason yet. But I think these are the things that you talk about, you grow, you build in the offseason. Then once week 1 is here, hopefully you see a more fine-tuned Chargers team than you've seen in the past.
Last one, Hayley, before we get you out of here. We are officially a week and a half away from football that actually counts. Week 1, Chargers versus the Dolphins. Obviously, last year was a very heavily talked about game, given all of the corresponding storylines that went with it. So now the Chargers and the Dolphins will go at each other once more. And I know we're early, it's still a week and a half away, but just in terms of, I don't know what, I guess like an early game preview, just in terms of things that you believe that you would expect to see this offense and defense implement based off of what you've seen here and there in the preseason. Give us your Hayley Elwood early preview, Chargers versus Dolphins.
So it's kind of funny, right? Because it's like, to me, it comes down to two distinct units, and it's the offensive unit of the Chargers versus the defensive unit of the Dolphins, because both are new. You have Vic Fangio obviously coming in, and he's someone who the Chargers players know very well. Brandon Staley knows very well. Not having Jalen Ramsey is a huge help and a huge benefit for the Chargers to not have to face him. But this is one of those games, and Pat Kerwin, who used to be a front office member of the league, he's now on Sirius XM NFL radio. He talks about these games as wild card games. These are the games that when it comes down, if you have the same record as another team and you're playing in week 18 and your seeding is going to be decided on maybe strength of schedule or wins and losses, these are the games that matter because these are the wild card games that the Dolphins aren't in your division, but they're in your conference. And what's the best thing that you can do? Go out and beat them, because we know that the AFC East is absolutely insane. It's sort of the new AFC West. What the AFC West was maybe a year ago is now the AFC East. And so when you get the opportunity to kind of start out fresh from the gate with an opponent that a win in September could mean everything potentially come December, January, that's huge. And so that's just kind of how I look at this one. Obviously, I'm not going to get into like the specifics of like must wins or anything like that, but there is a little extra like oomph on the line that you're not opening against maybe an NFC opponent or something like that. And you're opening up against an AFC opponent that's slated to potentially go pretty far. And they did last year, give or take a lot of the injuries. This is a much likely healthier Miami team that the Chargers are going to be seeing this year compared to when they saw them a year ago. So it should be a lot of fun. I'm sick of the QB discourse, though. I got to be honest. Like, let's move past it. Can we just be done with it?
Please.
I'm so over. Look, I think Chargers fans are very happy with their quarterback. I hope that Miami fans should be happy with theirs. Bengals fans should be happy with theirs. Let's all move on, move forward. It's okay.
Great, guys. It's okay. We can there's other things to talk about. I think hopefully we're past it. Hopefully we are done and we're moved on and we're good. But it is just really fun that week one's already here again. These off seasons for me just fly by like crazy, and it's going to be fun to actually have things to really talk about and games that really matter, Jake, like you said.
Absolutely.
Real football starts in a matter of days. We're less than 2 weeks away. Hayley, thank you so much for doing this. This has been so much fun. We are finally at the brink of regular season. Hayley, you were fantastic. What do you got that you're working on coming up?
We start our broadcast show in a couple weeks. I think we're filming that. That will air, I believe, on CBS2, KCBS in the market. I think it's Saturday nights, I want to say. So we got that. And then we're just, ready to get things going here. Ready to kick off this season, and it's going to be a lot of fun. Also fun to open at home, which, it doesn't happen all the time, but pretty cool. And also just really cool that game, they're going to retire Kellen Winslow and Charlie Joyner's numbers, which is an awesome sort of kickoff. And I think I'm not sure if this was planned this way. I have no intel on this, but to do it like Epic in Miami style, like to do it against the Dolphins is actually like a pretty cool little thing that I kind of find fun.
Fireworks in SoFi, a mere less than 2 weeks away. Hayley, thank you so much for doing this. For Hayley Elwood, Jake Hefner, Dan Wolkenstein, Chargers Unleashed, and LA Football Network. We'll talk to you next time on Chargers Unleashed.